Welcome to Literary Dialogs with Nina Serrano, where poets and writers read from their own works and discuss it. I'm your host, Nina Serrano. My guest today is author Lea Aschkenas, who has recently published a beautiful children's book set in Cuba entitled Arletis, Abuelo, and a Message in a Bottle. It takes place between California and Pinar del Rio. Welcome, author and librarian Lea Aschkenas.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nina.
Oh, you're welcome. I was hoping you would tell us the story of how Arletis, Abuelo, and Message in a Bottle came to be and came to be published.
Yes, I'd love to, because it has a interesting backstory. So I'll just start out by saying that this is my debut children's book, and it was published in April by Starbright Books. It's available in English and Spanish editions, and it's illustrated by Cornelius Van Wright and Ying Hua Hu, a husband-wife couple, and the Spanish is translated by Lawrence Schimel. So this is Arletis Abuelo and the Message in a Bottle is based on the true story of a little girl named Arletis, who on her 8th birthday found a message in a bottle on a beach near her home in rural Cuba. And she became pen pals with the older man who wrote the message. His name is Steve, and he is a sailor who lived on a tiny tugboat in the bay in Sausalito, California. So they have, as you can probably tell from what I've just said, there's a lot of differences between them. There's their ages, gender, ethnicity, language, although Steve had been studying Spanish at the time that Arletis found the letter, his message, so they were able to communicate in Spanish. There's also the U.S. embargo, which makes the U.S. and Cuba feel a lot farther apart than they actually are. But despite all of this, Arletis and Steve forged this really beautiful connection, a long-term connection. They started out as strangers, became pen pals, and then Steve actually traveled to Cuba and met Arletis and her family. And after this trip, he became like family to their family, hence the word abuelo, grandfather, in the title. So the way this story came to be is, like many writers, I'm not able to earn my living from my writing. So I have other jobs. I teach poetry with the California poets in the schools, and I work at a library. So many years ago, I was working at the Sausalito Public Library, and my first book had recently been published. It's an adult book, a memoir about living in Cuba for a year. So all of my coworkers knew that I was a writer. They knew I had this connection to Cuba. And one of them said to me, you know, Lee, there's this man that you should meet. He comes into the library all the time, and he has been to Cuba, and he has a really interesting story, and maybe you even want to write about it. So I asked to be introduced, and I met Steve, and I heard his story. He told me it at the checkout desk at the library, and I knew I did want to write about it. So I asked if I could interview him, and I got to go on his little tiny tugboat, which in itself is an interesting story. At the time I met him, he was in his 50s and had been living on this tiny, tiny tugboat for nearly 3 decades and working as a tugboat operator, sort of an isolated life, kind of cut off from society a bit by choice. And when I spoke to him on his boat, I right after that, I wrote an article. It was published in a travel magazine, but during the act of interviewing him, I felt like this was not even a bigger story, but it should be an illustrated story for children. He showed me families of the photos of the family, where they lived, their street, all the things Arletis did with her friends. So after my article, I went down to Cuba and I flew into Havana and I caught a bus to Pinar del Rio, which is about 2 hours to the west of Havana. And just like Steve had done years before, I spent about 4 or 5 days with the family. And then I came back to the US and I studied up a bit on children's books, and then I wrote my book. And I thought, I knew it's not easy to get published. That's been my life story, but I thought, oh, I already have this book that was published. And that book took 3 years to get published. So I thought this must be a little easier.
Excuse
But
me, could you tell us the name of that book, your first
oh,
book?
yes. Yes, thank you. It's called Es Cuba, Life and Love on an Illegal Island, and
Thank
it's
you.
published by Seal Press. So I sent out my manuscript for Arletty's Abuelo and the Message in a Bottle. And I got many, many, many rejections. And sometimes it seemed like each rejection had a different reason. I was told the story was too long. One editor said it was too sophisticated, even though as a teacher of poetry for kids, I'd shared it with the kids I taught, and I knew they could comprehend the idea of a message in a bottle. One editor thought it was too short and that it should be a middle grade chapter book, not illustrated. One editor said she really liked it and she had talked to everyone at the publishing house and they were really interested, but I had to make a change. And I needed to make abuelo into abuela. They didn't feel that it was right that an older man could be friends with a young girl, even though the friendship was really about him and her family. But I'm open to edits, I'm open to changes, but none of these seemed quite right. So I continued on and on and on. And finally, after 12 years, I got a publisher.
12 years.
Yeah.
What
I,
persistence.
I did. There's a few years along the way when I did give up for different points in time. What really inspired me to try again was when I teach poetry to kids, I always bring my adult book, Es Cuba, and I hold it up and I say, I want you to know an ordinary person like you can write a book. And all of my writing comes, even if it's not poetry, it comes from what I've learned from poetry. And one day a teacher said to me, a classroom teacher said, oh, it's really too bad you don't have a children's book to share with the kids. And I said, well, I do, but I can't get anyone to publish it. And she said, well, bring in what you wrote and read it to the kids and at least they can hear it. And it was their reactions and their enthusiasm that made me start up again, trying to get it published.
Wonderful. So wonderful that you did find a publisher, because my great granddaughter, Lily, just read the book and she loved it.
Oh,
And she doesn't usually like reading and she doesn't like reading books at
okay.
all, but she loved reading this book. And her only problem with it was that there were some Spanish words in it that she had trouble with. So she's going to go back and read it again.
Oh, wonderful. And then, of course, also I think most of them are in a glossary in the back. So I know kids don't automatically look for that, but you could let her know that too.
I will. Well, this is a wonderful story. And it was a wonderful story. I also read it.
Thank you, Nina. And
Yes, a
I think,
wonderful story. And I'm just amazed that I have never seen any other children's book in English about Cuba. Have you?
There are a few. And so working at the library, that was a good way for me to see what was needed. Most of them, very few of them are picture books. Most of them are for older readers, and almost all of them are written by Cuban exiles, and they have a certain political slant, which involves writing about how their parents left after the revolution. I definitely, there is one other children's picture book set in contemporary Cuba, which involves a car ride across the island. Um, but there's just often issues where there's always something put in about the politics and um, how Cubans are oppressed. And I really wanted to share a story of a happy childhood in contemporary Cuba.
And also a marvelous and old myth, the message in a bottle. I mean, I've always heard about a message in a bottle. Of course, I never have found a message in a bottle, but it's nice to think that there is such a thing. And my granddaughter was totally thrilled with it.
Oh, that's so wonderful. That
My
makes me
great
really happy to
granddaughter,
hear.
actually, that is.
And how old is she?
She's 9.
Oh, that's the perfect age, yeah, for the
Yes.
book.
So, what about the real Arlettis?
Yes, thank you for asking. So, like I said, the book took 12 years to get published, and or not even to get published, I say 12 years to get a publisher. I was very excited when that happened. That was 2019. And at that point, I had lost touch a little with both Arletis and Steve. We'd all lost touch with each other. It had been, more than a decade. So I contacted Arletis and Steve. I had to have a Cuban friend track down Arletis' different phone number than when I had first known her. And we decided that Steve and I would go to Cuba. I really wanted to celebrate that we'd go back and get to see Arletis. And at this point, she was an adult. Um, she was 23 years old
Oh,
when
my.
and she had uh, two very, very young, a toddler and a very young child. And so Steve and I went back, and it was a wonderful experience. It was an adventure. We caught a taxi that broke down part of the way outside of Havana. It should have taken 2 hours. It took half a day to get to Pinar del Rio. And we spent several days with Arletis, her children, her parents, her family. And yeah, that kind of reconnected all of us. It was a really moving visit. And then, of course, as everyone knows, the next year, 2020, COVID happened. So this book, which should have taken 2 years for illustrations and translation, ended up taking 4 years. So again, I
4 years.
went 4 more years. So it took 16 years total.
16 years from when you wrote it to when you published it?
Yes, I wrote it in 2007 and it came out in 2023.
Wow.
So I again wanted to celebrate. I thought I deserved that. So I wanted to go back to Cuba once more. At this point, Steve, who is now 75, um, he wasn't able to come with me because he decided after 50 years living on his boat, he needed to live in a house. It was getting a little hard. So he was in the process of moving. So I went back on my own to Cuba. I went last February. My publisher felt very bad about how long it had taken for the book to come out. So they got me advance copies. And I went and I presented it at Cuba's International Book Festival. And Arletis and her family traveled over from Pinar del Rio to Havana to be there for the event. And it was so moving because she knew I'd written this book about her, but she hadn't seen the illustrations. She didn't know what it was like. And when I would look out at her in the audience, she was crying. She was just so moved at seeing these images of herself as a child. And her two children at this point were 5 and 8. Arletis was 8 when she found the message in a bottle. Her younger sister was 5, so it kind of went full circle.
Lea, I wonder if you might read a little bit from the book for our listeners.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. Just before Arletis' 8th birthday, her parents said they had a very special present for her. They'd rented a beach house for a weekend at Playa Bailen, about 30 miles away. Arletis was so happy. She felt like choreographing a dance right then and there. On the bus ride to Playa Bailen, Arletis scanned the horizon for her first ever glimpse of the big blue sea that outlined her island. On her birthday, Arletis made a special wish. Now that she had seen the edge of her island, she wanted to know more. Closing her eyes, she whispered her wish to the sea. Then she set off to search for seashells. On her walk, Arletis found a big green bottle at the edge of the water. Its top was sealed shut with thick silver tape, and a sheet of paper rested inside. Arletis' father used a knife to cut off the tape. Her mother used a twig to fish out the paper. It was a message, and to everyone's surprise, it was written in a foreign language. Arletis felt her heartbeat speed up as she realized the bottle was not from her island. It had traveled from another country. Even though she couldn't make out the words, Arletis wrote a reply to the address at the bottom of the message. She wrote in cursive and as neatly as possible, hoping that somehow whoever wrote the original message would understand her reply. She wrote about her life, about her family in her beautiful street. She asked every question she could think of about life in this other country. Her mother said her letter was lovely, but she told Arletis not to get her hopes up. Still, Arletis hoped. She waited for a reply as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months. When Steve received the letter from the alligator-shaped island, he knew right away it was the response to his message in a bottle. 5 months before, he'd given the bottle to a neighbor who was going sailing in a faraway sea. On his voyage, the neighbor had thrown the bottle into the water with Steve's message, which read, "If you find this bottle, please write and tell me about your world." Ever since, Steve had been dreaming about where his bottle might land. Steve saw that his bottle had washed ashore in a Spanish-speaking country, and he couldn't believe his luck. 2 months after Arletis wrote to Steve, the mail carrier came to her part of the street. He blew his whistle and called out, "Arletis!" Arletis carried her letter, the first she'd ever received, with great care. Steve answered every question she had asked. He included a photo of himself on his tiny tugboat and wrote that his country wasn't an island like hers, but sometimes his boat felt like one. It looked to Arletis as if Steve were old enough to be a grandfather. Arletis had always wished for a grandfather. So she decided to address her next letter, "Querido Abuelo Esteban," Dear Grandfather Steve. She wrote that she hoped one day he could visit her and her family like a real grandfather. Arletis and Abuelo Esteban wrote each other as regularly as the monthly full moon. To know when the mail carrier might next come whistling through her neighborhood, All Arletis had to do was to look up at the night sky and watch the moon growing bigger. After Arletis and Abuelo Esteban had exchanged many letters, Abuelo Esteban wrote that he had some exciting news. He would be coming for a visit. When Arletis read this, she couldn't stop smiling. Now she would be able to ask Abuelo Esteban all the questions that wouldn't fit in a letter. Abuelo Esteban arrived at Arletis' house carrying a long roll of paper in his hands. Un regalo, a gift, he said as he stepped into Arletis' family's tiny living room. Arletis stood still while her stomach turned in somersaults. Abuelo Esteban unrolled the paper to reveal a map he'd made showing the path his bottle had traveled. First on his friend's boat, and then on the wide open sea to Arletis' island. It was the most beautiful map Arletis had ever seen.
Oh, wonderful story. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Yes.
Lea Aschkenas, the author of Arletis, Abuelo, and the Message in a Bottle. Wow, that must have been, well, just to find a message in a bottle. I mean, she's one in a million humans to do that. And then to actually meet the person and to have him become her honorary grandfather. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story. Could you please tell listeners how they can get this book? I can tell you as a great grandmother that it makes a great hit with the kids.
Thank you. Yeah, so I always recommend that people try Amazon alternatives. It is available on Amazon. It's available through Bookshop.
Okay, say the name of the title and spell it out.
Okay, so Arletis Abuelo and the Message in a Bottle is available on Bookshop, which is BOOKSHOP. And I believe, I'm not sure if it's .org or .com, but it's an online bookseller. It should also be available in bookstores and libraries, and
Can you get it? I guess you can get it on Amazon.
you can get it on Amazon. And if your local independent bookstore doesn't have it, or your library, please ask them to get it.
And the title is Arletis, that's spelled Arletis, Abuelo, and the Message in a Bottle.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope listeners share this wonderful book with their children friends.
Thank you, Nina.
Oh, thank you so much, Lea Aschkenas.